9% that these are the remains of Richard III. That's at its most conservative. We would actually suggest it's between 99.999 and 99.99999% that these are indeed the remains of Richard III.
They found a skeleton under a parking lot. When scientists tested the DNA, their faces went pale. What they discovered wasn't just the identity of a lost king. It was a royal secret so dark, so absolutely scandalous, that it could destroy everything we believe about the monarchy. A bloodline built on lies, a throne claimed by impostors, 500 years of deception, shattered by a single DNA test.
What we see is that royal succession takes various twists and turns over time. So the fact that there may, and it is a very big speculation, there may be a break there, doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on later successions.
You won't believe what King Richard III's bones just exposed. The truth they never wanted you to know. For more than 500 years, the final resting place of Richard III remained one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The last Plantagenet King of England died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, cut down in what would become the final major engagement of the Wars of the Roses. Historical records from the time documented that his body was taken to Leicester and buried without much ceremony at the Greyfriars Friary. The king, who had ruled England for just over 2 years, was laid to rest quickly and quietly, his enemies now in control of the narrative. As decades turned into centuries, the friary itself was demolished during the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. The buildings were torn down, the land was repurposed, and the precise location of the friary gradually faded from public memory. By the 20th century, most historians believe that Richard's grave was simply lost to time. Some local legends even claim that his bones had been dug up during the Reformation and thrown into the River Soar, though there was no real evidence to support this dramatic tale. The general consensus among academics was that wherever Richard III had been buried, those remains were now impossible to locate. That assumption held firm until 2012, when a team led by the University of Leicester Archaeological Services decided to investigate a rather unpromising location in the city center. A group of researchers, supported by the Richard III Society and working with old maps and historical documents, believed they had identified where the Greyfriars Friary once stood. The problem was that this area was now covered by tarmac and buildings, including a social services car park. Despite the seemingly slim chances of success, the team received permission to dig. What happened next shocked everyone involved. Within just days of beginning the excavation, on the very first day of digging, in fact, the team uncovered human remains. The skeleton, initially labeled simply as Skeleton 1, was found in a location that corresponded remarkably well with what would have been the choir area of the Friary Church. This was significant because historical accounts specifically mentioned that Richard had been buried in the choir. But finding a skeleton in roughly the right place was far from proof. Medieval friaries contained many burials, and Leicester had been a populated area for centuries. The skeleton itself, however, began to tell a compelling story. The remains belonged to a man who had died in his early 30s. According to historical records, Richard III was 32 years old when he fell at Bosworth. The bones showed extensive evidence of trauma, particularly around the skull. Forensic analysis identified at least 10 separate injuries, with 8 of them concentrated on the head. These were not minor wounds. They were the kinds of devastating blows that would have been inflicted by medieval weapons like swords, halberds, and possibly maces. Some of the cuts to the skull showed patterns consistent with the helmet having been removed or torn away during combat, leaving the head exposed to repeated strikes. 2 injuries in particular stood out as immediately fatal. One was a large slice that had removed a section of the skull. The other was a penetrating wound to the base of the skull that would have driven deep into the brain. Contemporary accounts of Richard's death described a brutal final battle, where the king, fighting on foot, was surrounded and overwhelmed by enemy forces. The skeletal evidence matched these descriptions with disturbing precision. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of the skeleton was its spine. The vertebral column showed a severe lateral curvature, a condition known as scoliosis. This curvature was quite pronounced, creating a distinctive S shape that would have caused one shoulder to sit noticeably higher than the other. The condition would also have reduced the person's overall height by several inches. Interestingly, this matched something that contemporary descriptions of Richard III had mentioned. Writers from his own time noted that he had uneven shoulders, though they described it in various ways and with varying degrees of emphasis, depending on their political allegiances. This detail took on enormous cultural significance after Richard's death, particularly through the work of William Shakespeare. In his play Richard III, written more than a century after the king's death, Shakespeare transformed this physical characteristic into a symbol of moral corruption. The historical Richard's uneven shoulders became the monstrous hunchback of the play, a twisted villain whose deformed body supposedly reflected his deformed soul. The real skeletal evidence told a different story. Yes, Richard had scoliosis, and yes, it would have been visible, but it was a medical condition, not evidence of wickedness, and certainly not the grotesque deformity of Tudor propaganda. The archaeological team applied several scientific dating methods to the remains. Radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes in organic material, placed the bones firmly in the late 15th century. The date range was consistent with someone who had died around 1485. Additional isotopic analysis of the teeth provided information about diet. The chemical signatures showed a pattern of food consumption that included high amounts of protein from expensive sources, particularly meat and seafood. This was the diet of someone at the very top of medieval society, someone who had access to luxury foods that ordinary people rarely, if ever, ate. Every piece of evidence seemed to fit. The location matched the historical records. The age at death matched. The combat injuries matched the accounts of Bosworth Field. The spinal curvature matched contemporary descriptions. The radiocarbon dating was correct. The diet was appropriate for royalty. But in archaeology and forensic science, circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, is not the same as proof. There have been cases throughout history where all the circumstantial details seem to align perfectly, only for later analysis to reveal a case of mistaken identity. The research team knew that to make a definitive identification, to stand before the world and declare with certainty that these bones belonged to King Richard III, they would need something more conclusive. They would need genetic evidence. They would need to extract DNA from bones that had been in the ground for more than 5 centuries and find living people whose DNA could be compared to it. The task seemed almost impossible. Ancient DNA degrades over time and is easily contaminated by modern genetic material. Finding relatives after so many generations presented its own enormous challenges. But if it could be done, if the genetic analysis could confirm what all the other evidence suggested, then one of history's greatest cold cases would finally be solved. With a skeleton that appeared to match Richard III in every physical detail, the pressure was now on the scientists to prove it beyond any shadow of doubt. The world was watching, and the archaeological community demanded certainty. Could genetic material extracted from bones that had spent more than 500 years buried in the ground really provide definitive proof of identity? The challenge facing the research team was immense, but if they succeeded, it would represent one of the most remarkable achievements in the field of ancient DNA analysis. The fundamental problem with ancient DNA is that it degrades over time. When a person dies, the genetic material in their cells begins to break down almost immediately. Bacteria, moisture, temperature fluctuations, and chemical processes in the soil all contribute to this deterioration. After 5 centuries underground, any surviving DNA would likely be fragmentary and damaged. Even worse, archaeological sites are rarely sterile environments. Modern DNA from archaeologists, laboratory workers, or even curious visitors can easily contaminate ancient samples, potentially leading to false results. The Leicester team would need to work with extraordinary care to avoid any such contamination. Fortunately, not all DNA degrades at the same rate, and some types are more likely to survive than others. The researchers focused their efforts on 2 particular kinds of genetic material that have special properties when it comes to inheritance: These were mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. Each of these passes through family lines in very specific ways, which makes them particularly useful for tracing ancestry across many generations. Mitochondrial DNA, often abbreviated as mtDNA, is found not in the cell nucleus like most of our genetic material, but in structures called mitochondria. These are the tiny power plants inside cells that produce energy. What makes mitochondrial DNA special for genealogical purposes is how it gets passed down through families. It comes exclusively from the mother. When a child is conceived, essentially all of the mitochondria in the fertilized egg come from the mother's egg cell, not from the father's sperm. This means that you, your siblings, your mother's siblings, your maternal grandmother, and so on, all share virtually identical mitochondrial DNA. This creates an unbroken genetic line that can be traced back through many generations, as long as you follow the female line. A daughter passes her mitochondrial DNA to all her children. Her daughters then pass it to their children, and so on. Sons receive it too, but they do not pass it on to their offspring. This pattern of inheritance meant that if the researchers could find living descendants of Richard III through an unbroken line of females, they could compare the mitochondrial DNA from those living people with the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skeleton. Finding such descendants required meticulous genealogical detective work. The researchers traced Richard III's family tree through his sister, Anne of York. Anne had married and had children, and the genealogists worked forward through time, generation by generation, following the female line. They had to identify not just who had children, but specifically which children were daughters, since only daughters could continue the unbroken mitochondrial line. They needed to track births, marriages, and deaths across 5 centuries, through wars, plagues, migrations, and all the chaos of human history. After extensive research, they identified 2 living individuals who descended from Anne of York through an unbroken female line spanning 19 generations. One was Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker living in London. The other was Wendy Duldig, a researcher based in Canada. Neither of them had any particular connection to royalty in their daily lives. They were ordinary people going about their business, unaware that they carried in their cells a genetic signature that had been passed down mother to daughter for half a millennium. In genetic terms, they were Richard III's great-nieces, 16 times removed. Blood samples were collected from both Michael Ibsen and Wendy Duldig. Meanwhile, in the laboratory, specialists carefully extracted DNA from the skeleton found in Leicester. The process of obtaining usable genetic material from ancient bones is painstaking and requires specialized facilities to prevent contamination. Small samples of bone were ground into powder, and chemicals were used to separate out any surviving DNA fragments. The researchers focused particularly on extracting mitochondrial DNA, which had the best chance of having survived in sufficient quantities for analysis. When the laboratory results came back, they revealed something extraordinary. The mitochondrial DNA sequence from the skeleton was a perfect match for the mitochondrial DNA from both Michael Ibsen and Wendy Duldig. All 3 individuals shared the same genetic signature that had been passed down through the female line from Anne of York and her mother, Cecily Neville. The probability of this being a coincidence was astronomically small. Statistical analysis showed that the odds of a random person from the Leicester area having this particular mitochondrial DNA sequence were vanishingly tiny. On the 4th of February 2013, the University of Leicester held a press conference that would make headlines around the world. Richard Buckley, the lead archaeologist, along with geneticists and other members of the research team, announced their findings to an audience of journalists, historians, and curious members of the public. The conclusion was unequivocal. The skeleton found beneath the car park was, beyond any reasonable doubt, that of King Richard III. The physical evidence, the archaeological context, the radiocarbon dating, and now the genetic analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. After 500 years, the last Plantagenet king had been found. The announcement created an immediate sensation. News outlets across Britain and around the world ran stories about the discovery. Social media exploded with discussions about the finding. The city of Leicester, which had previously been more famous for its football club than its royal connections, suddenly found itself at the center of an international story. Plans were immediately put in place for a proper reburial, with debates beginning about where and how a medieval king should be laid to rest in the 21st century. For many people, this was where the story ended. A mystery had been solved, a king had been identified, and history had been made. The combination of cutting-edge genetic science and traditional archaeological methods had achieved something remarkable. But the scientists were not quite finished with their analysis. They had successfully used mitochondrial DNA to confirm the skeleton's identity through the female line. However, there was another type of DNA they wanted to examine. The Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, offered the possibility of confirming the identification through the male line as well. In theory, this should have been a straightforward confirmation. Richard III was a male member of the Plantagenet dynasty, a family that traced its lineage back through many generations of English kings. The Y chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son, just as mitochondrial DNA passes almost unchanged from mother to child. If they could find living men who descended through an unbroken male line from the same ancestors as Richard, those men should share the same Y chromosome. The genealogists traced the male line back to Edward III, who had reigned from 1327 to 1377. Edward was Richard III's great-great-grandfather. The researchers identified several living men, primarily from the Somerset family, who descended through an unbroken male line from Edward III. These men agreed to provide DNA samples for testing. The expectation was that this would provide a final piece of confirmation, adding genetic evidence from the paternal line to match the maternal line evidence they already had. The laboratory extracted Y chromosome DNA from the skeleton and compared it to the samples from the living male line descendants. The researchers prepared their analysis, expecting another perfect match that would close the book on any remaining questions. But when the results came through, they showed something completely unexpected. The Y chromosome from the skeleton did not match the Y chromosome from the Somerset descendants. Instead of providing confirmation, the test had revealed something shocking. Somewhere in the chain of generations connecting Richard III to these living relatives, there had been what geneticists carefully call a false paternity event. In simpler terms, somewhere along the line, a child's legal father was not his biological father. The implications of this discovery would prove to be just as significant as the identification of the skeleton itself. The discovery that Richard III's Y chromosome did not match his supposed male line relatives sent ripples of shock through both the scientific and historical communities. While the mitochondrial DNA had conclusively proven the skeleton's identity through the maternal line, the paternal line had just revealed something entirely unexpected. This was not a failure of the identification process. The skeleton was definitely Richard III, but the Y chromosome analysis had accidentally uncovered evidence of a secret that had remained hidden for centuries. Somewhere in the family tree, a break in the bloodline had occurred. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to understand how the Y chromosome works in genealogy. Unlike most of our DNA, which gets shuffled and mixed with each generation, the Y chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son. A man receives his Y chromosome from his father, who received it from his father, and so on back through time. Barring rare mutations, all men in an unbroken male line should have virtually identical Y chromosomes. This makes it an excellent tool for tracing paternal ancestry, which is exactly why the researchers wanted to use it to confirm Richard III's identity. The test involved comparing Richard's Y chromosome with samples from living men who descended through an unbroken male line from Edward III. Edward had been King of England from 1327 to 1377, and he was Richard III's great-great-grandfather. Multiple sons of Edward III had themselves produced sons, creating several male line branches that continued down through the centuries. The researchers focused particularly on descendants through the Somerset line. These modern men had no throne to claim and no particular political stake in the outcome. They were simply people whose family trees, when traced carefully back through the generations, connected them to the Plantagenet kings through an unbroken chain of fathers and sons. When the laboratory analysis showed that Richard's Y chromosome did not match these descendants, it meant only one thing. At some point in the 19 generations separating Richard III from these living relatives, a woman had given birth to a child whose biological father was not her husband. The child would have been raised as legitimate, would have borne his legal father's name, and would have passed that name down to his own descendants. But genetically, the Y chromosome line had been broken. A different man's genetic material had entered the family tree. The immediate question was obvious. When did this happen? The break could have occurred at any point across those 19 generations, and each possibility carried dramatically different implications for history. If the false paternity event happened recently, within the last few generations of the Somerset family line, then it would be interesting from a genealogical perspective, but would have no real historical significance. It would mean that the modern descendants were not actually related through the male line to the Plantagenets, but it would not affect anything about medieval history or the legitimacy of any actual kings. However, if the break occurred further back in time, particularly somewhere within the royal lineage itself, the implications became far more serious. Medieval monarchy was based fundamentally on the principle of legitimate succession through blood. Kings claimed their right to rule based on being the true heir of their father, who was the true heir of his father, and so on back through a supposedly unbroken chain of legitimate descent. Divine right, political authority, legal claims to land and titles. All of these rested on the foundation of proven bloodline. A king who was not the biological son of his predecessor was, in the eyes of medieval law and custom, not the rightful king at all. The researchers examined several possibilities for where the break might have occurred. One candidate was John of Gaunt, one of Edward III's sons. John was an immensely powerful figure in the late 14th century, and his descendants formed the House of Lancaster, one of the two main factions in the Wars of the Roses. If John of Gaunt was not actually Edward III's biological son, then the entire Lancastrian claim to the throne would have been built on false foundations. Every Lancastrian king, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, would have had no legitimate right to rule according to the very principles they claimed to uphold. Another possibility that historians considered was even more personally relevant to Richard III himself. There had been rumors, even during the 15th century, that Richard's own father might not have been Richard, Duke of York. The story went that Richard's mother, Cecily Neville, had engaged in an affair while her husband was away at war in France. If this rumor were true, and if Richard himself was the product of that affair, then he would never have had any legitimate claim to the English throne. His entire reign would have been based on a biological falsehood, though of course Richard himself might never have known it. The historical records from Richard's own time do contain some tantalizing hints that this rumor existed. Political propaganda during the period was vicious, and opponents were not above spreading scandalous stories about their enemies. After Richard seized the throne in 1483, declaring his nephews illegitimate and claiming the crown for himself, there were whispers suggesting that perhaps Richard himself was the illegitimate one. Whether these whispers had any basis in fact or were simply political smears is impossible to know with certainty. What the DNA evidence proved was that somewhere, somehow, an illegitimate child had been born and raised as legitimate within the royal family. The implications extended beyond just individual legitimacy. The Wars of the Roses, which consumed England for 30 years between 1455 and 1485, were fought specifically over the question of legitimate succession. The House of York, Richard's family, and the House of Lancaster both claimed descent from Edward III. Both insisted they had the superior claim to the throne based on bloodline. Thousands of people died in battles, executions, and political murders because of this dispute over who was the rightful heir. Noble families were destroyed, wealth was confiscated, and the country was torn apart by civil war. The DNA evidence suggested that this entire conflict might have been based on a false premise. If the Plantagenet bloodline itself had been compromised by illegitimacy, then neither the Yorkists nor the Lancastrians had a perfect claim. They were fighting over inheritance rights that neither side could truly prove, shedding blood to defend a principle of legitimate descent that their own family trees violated. The irony was almost overwhelming. Medieval society placed enormous importance on legitimate birth, yet the royal family that claimed to exemplify that principle had apparently failed to maintain it. The genetic evidence could not pinpoint exactly when or where the false paternity event occurred. DNA analysis can tell us that a break happened, but without testing DNA from individuals at each generation, which is obviously impossible for people who died centuries ago, we cannot identify the specific point of discontinuity. The secret remained partially hidden, tantalizingly close to revelation, but ultimately just out of reach. Historians combed through old chronicles, letters, and documents, looking for any hints or clues that might narrow down the possibilities. Some researchers pointed out that false paternity was probably more common in medieval aristocratic families than most people realize. Noble marriages were political arrangements, often made when the bride and groom were children. Love matches were rare. Husbands were frequently away at war, on diplomatic missions, or managing distant estates. Opportunities for infidelity certainly existed, and medieval people were no more or less prone to human weaknesses than people of any other era. The difference was that in noble families, particularly royal ones, the stakes were so much higher. An illegitimate child in a peasant family might face social stigma, but an illegitimate child in a royal family could throw the entire political order into chaos. The DNA discovery did not change the confirmed identification of Richard III. The mitochondrial evidence remained solid, and the skeleton in Leicester was definitely the last Plantagenet king. But the Y chromosome analysis had opened up a fascinating and troubling question about the nature of royal legitimacy itself. It suggested that the very foundation on which medieval monarchs based their authority, the unbroken chain of legitimate descent, might have been more fragile than anyone at the time realized. A ghost of scandal now haunted the Plantagenet family tree, and while we might never know exactly whose secret it was, we knew with scientific certainty that someone, somewhere in that illustrious lineage, had harbored a secret that challenged everything the monarchy claimed to represent. While the revelation about the Y chromosome mismatch dominated headlines and sparked intense historical debate, the skeleton itself continued to provide remarkable insights into who Richard III actually was as a living, breathing person. The DNA scandal was certainly shocking, but it represented only one aspect of what the bones could tell us. The physical remains offered a unique opportunity to separate 5 centuries of myth, propaganda, and literary invention from the historical reality of the man who ruled England for just over 2 years. Perhaps no aspect of Richard III's reputation had been more influential than the image created by William Shakespeare in his play written in the 1590s. Shakespeare's Richard is one of literature's great villains, a scheming murderer whose twisted body reflects his twisted soul. The play opens with Richard himself describing his physical deformities, claiming he was sent into the world unfinished and deformed. This characterization became so powerful, so embedded in popular culture, that for centuries most people simply assumed it was true. Richard III was the hunchback king, the monster whose appearance marked him as evil. When the scientists examined the spine of the Leicester skeleton in detail, they found clear evidence of scoliosis. This is a medical condition where the spine curves laterally, creating an S or C shape when viewed from behind, rather than the straight vertical line of a healthy spine. In Richard's case, the curvature was quite severe. The spine bent sharply to the right, and this would have had several visible effects on his appearance. One shoulder would have sat noticeably higher than the other, probably by several inches. His torso would have appeared somewhat twisted. The condition would also have reduced his overall height, probably making him 3 or 4 inches shorter than he would have been with a straight spine. However, and this is crucial, scoliosis is not the same thing as being a hunchback. A true hunchback involves a forward curvature of the spine, creating a prominent hump on the back. Richard's condition involved lateral curvature. While it certainly would have been visible, especially to people who knew him well, it was not the grotesque deformity that Shakespeare described. The skeleton showed no evidence of the withered arm that appears in the play. There was no sign that his legs were different lengths, another detail sometimes mentioned in hostile accounts written after his death. More importantly, the bones showed clear evidence that Richard had been physically active and capable. The muscle attachment points on the skeleton were well developed, indicating strong musculature. This was not the body of someone crippled by disability. Medieval armor was heavy and physically demanding to wear. Leading men in battle required strength, stamina, and the ability to move quickly when necessary. The skeleton proved that Richard's scoliosis, while significant, had not prevented him from living the active, martial life expected of a medieval nobleman and king. He had adapted to his condition and functioned effectively despite it. This revelation was particularly poignant because it showed how Richard's enemies had weaponized his medical condition after his death. Contemporary accounts written during his lifetime mention that he had uneven shoulders, but they do not describe him as deformed or monstrous. It was only after he died, when the Tudor dynasty needed to justify their conquest and delegitimize the king they had killed, that the descriptions became more extreme. By the time Shakespeare wrote his play over a century later, working under a Tudor descendant, the exaggeration had reached its peak. What had been a noticeable but manageable physical condition was transformed into a symbol of moral corruption. The bones and teeth also preserved a chemical record of Richard's life that scientists could read through isotopic analysis. Different geographical regions have slightly different ratios of stable isotopes in their water and soil, and these signatures get incorporated into the bones and teeth of people who live there. By analyzing these isotopic ratios, researchers could track where Richard had lived at different stages of his life. The evidence showed that he moved around England quite a bit during his childhood and adolescence, which made perfect sense given the political instability of the Wars of the Roses. His family's fortunes rose and fell. They spent time in exile. They moved between different estates and strongholds as the political situation changed. The isotopic evidence from his adult bones told a different story. Once Richard reached maturity, and particularly after he became king, his location stabilized and his diet changed dramatically. The nitrogen and carbon isotopes in his bones revealed what he had been eating in his final years, and the pattern was unmistakable. This was the diet of someone at the absolute pinnacle of medieval society. He consumed large quantities of high-status protein from luxury meat sources. Contemporary records tell us that royal feasts included exotic birds like swan, crane, and heron, as well as venison from deer and wild boar. Only the wealthy elite had regular access to such foods, and kings had access to the most extravagant options of all. Even more revealing was what the isotopes indicated about his alcohol consumption. By analyzing the chemical signatures in the bone, researchers estimated that Richard was drinking approximately 1 bottle of wine every single day during his final years. This level of consumption was not unusual for medieval royalty, who had unlimited access to wine and viewed it as a normal part of daily life. Water was often unsafe to drink, and wine was considered both healthier and more appropriate for someone of high status. Nevertheless, the sheer quantity documented in Richard's bones provided concrete evidence of the kind of lavish lifestyle that only a crowned monarch could afford. Perhaps the most striking achievement of the scientific analysis was facial reconstruction. Using detailed three-dimensional scans of the skull, forensic artists employed established techniques to rebuild Richard's face layer by layer. They began with the bone structure, then added digital representations of muscles in their anatomically correct positions. Soft tissue depths, based on extensive databases of measurements from modern populations, were applied according to age, sex, and build. Skin texture and coloring came last, informed partly by the DNA analysis. The face that emerged from this process was remarkably different from the sneering villain of stage and screen. It showed a man with a relatively thin face, a somewhat prominent chin, and a composed, serious expression. When compared to contemporary portraits painted during Richard's lifetime or shortly after his death, the resemblance was striking. This provided yet another confirmation that the skeleton was genuine. Portraits can be idealized or distorted for political purposes, but the basic structure of the face in the reconstruction matched what artists had painted 500 years ago. The DNA analysis added further details to this picture. Genetic markers indicated that Richard most likely had blue eyes. Analysis of genes related to hair color suggested that as a child he probably had blonde hair, which then darkened as he matured into adulthood. This was entirely consistent with Northern European genetics and matched what some contemporary descriptions had mentioned. For the first time in 5 centuries, people could look at a scientifically informed recreation of Richard's actual appearance and see a real human being rather than a caricature. The final chapter in the skeleton's testimony came from the wounds that killed him. Forensic analysis identified 11 separate injuries on the bones, 9 of them to the skull. 2 of these were immediately fatal. One was a large blade wound that sliced away a section of the back of the skull. The weapon had probably been a sword or possibly a halberd, and the blow had been delivered with tremendous force. The other fatal injury was at the base of the skull, where a blade had penetrated deeply, almost certainly into the brain. Either wound would have caused death within moments. The pattern of injuries told a story about Richard's final moments at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The concentration of wounds on the head strongly suggested that his helmet had been removed or knocked off during the fighting, leaving his skull exposed. Multiple blows had rained down on him, probably from several attackers at once. This matched historical accounts that described Richard fighting surrounded by enemies after his charge toward Henry Tudor had become isolated from his own supporting forces. He died on foot, probably on his knees or falling, struck repeatedly by men who recognized that they had the king at their mercy. Additional injuries to the skeleton suggested what happened after death. There were wounds to the ribs and pelvis that showed no signs of healing, and were therefore inflicted either at the moment of death or shortly after. These were probably humiliation wounds, struck at a corpse to show contempt for a defeated enemy. Medieval battles sometimes saw this kind of post-mortem violence against particularly hated opponents. Historical accounts mention that Richard's body was stripped naked, thrown over a horse, and displayed publicly in Leicester before burial. The skeleton bore silent witness to this final indignity. Yet despite everything, despite the centuries of vilification, despite the propaganda and the plays and the myths, the bones told a truth that no amount of political spin could erase. Richard III had been a real person, a man with a medical condition he could not control, who lived in violent times and met a violent end. He fought to the last moment at Bosworth, leading from the front rather than fleeing. Whatever his political decisions, whatever moral questions might surround his seizure of the throne and the fate of his nephews, the physical evidence showed courage in his final moments. The victors wrote the history and created the monster, but the bones wrote a different story, one of a warrior king who faced death in battle rather than surrender. In the end, science gave Richard III something that 500 years of history had denied him, the chance to be seen as he actually was, rather than as his enemies wanted him remembered.